This group of quotes are all related. They cover May 16th through June 4th, 1834, during what is called Zion's Camp, when Joseph Smith and many others walked across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri to help church members in Missouri who were being violently forced to leave their homes by people who hated them and their religion. During this trip, some very interesting things happened. I'll start at the end on June 4th with a letter that Joseph wrote to his wife Emma. The copy of the letter is found in Joseph Smith Letter Book 2, pages 57 to 59. But I'll just read the relevant part here. It says, "The whole of our journey, in the midst of so large a company of social, honest, and sincere men, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as proof of its divine authenticity." Now, this isn't specifically declared as a revelation from God to Joseph, so it's going to have to go in the most likely category, at least for now, but we'll come back to it later. So for now, the land that Zion's camp walked across was most likely Nephite territory, but from Revelation so far, the land is definitely at least part of Book of Mormon lands in general. And as an interesting side note relating to the mounds which Joseph is talking about, they're from the Adena and Hopewell mound builder cultures, which are American given names. We don't know what those cultures called themselves. The Hopewell are estimated to have lived from the 500s BC to the 400s AD in the eastern half of the United States and Canada, with the oldest site being down in Florida. They had metal weapons and armor, including swords, scimitars, axes, headplates, breastplates, and arm shields. They built forts surrounded by massive ditches and dirt embankments, with palisade log fences and towers all along the top. They had many dirt mounds filled with the bodies of their dead. And haplogroup X2A DNA, which originates from the Middle East, is found in their bones, which again predate European contact, estimated between the 500s BC to the 400s AD. This culture matches the Nephite Lamanite cultures in so many ways. The Adena culture is older and matches up with the Jaredites. If you haven't watched my videos about the mound builders, I'll leave a link in the description box below. I go into more detail and reference you to people I've learned from who go into much more detail than I do. Anyway, all the way from Ohio to Missouri, Zion's camp had been marching right through some of the most condensed areas of the mound builder ruins. On May 16, 1834, they were traveling between Springfield and Dayton, Ohio, and the following incident happened. It's found in George A. Smith's journal, and it says, "On Friday the 16th, I got into the wagon to ride a short distance with Presidents Joseph and Hiram Smith and Brother Ezra Thayer. We were traveling through a thicket of small timber of recent growth. Brother Joseph said, 'I feel very much depressed in spirits. There has been a great deal of bloodshed here at some time. When a man of God passes through a place where much blood has been shed, he will feel depressed in spirits and feel lonesome and uncomfortable.' We soon came out of the timber where a large farm had been cleared, and to the left of the road was a mound 60 feet high, occupying about an acre of ground set all over with apple trees, which were growing in a very thrifty manner. We went to the mound and found that holes had been dug in it which disclosed the fact that it was filled with human bones. Hiram said he believed that a great army had sometime been slain and piled up and covered with earth, an ancient manner of burying the dead from the battlefield. The country around for miles was level." Now, the version in History of the Church Volume 2 is pretty much the same, but as I mentioned before, some things in the History of the Church books are written in the first person as if Joseph Smith wrote them himself, because that was a common practice among writers in the 1800s. But some things in the History of the Church books are not directly from Joseph Smith. But whether it be from others or Joseph, I'll show the original source material as often as I can find it. Anyway, that mound still stands today. It's called Enon Mound, and you can go visit it. Levi Hancock also touches on this experience in his journal. Now, Levi is writing this later, but he says, "I then remembered what he, Joseph, had said a few days before, while passing many mounds on our way that was left of us. Said he, 'There are the bodies of wicked men who have died and are angry at us. If they can take the advantage of us, they will. For if we live, they will have no hope.' I could not comprehend it, but supposed it was all right." Now, because these quotes aren't directly from Joseph, they'll have to go in the maybe category for now. But again, from the revelations we've gone over so far, the land is definitely part of Book of Mormon lands in general. This next incident happened after the camp crossed the Illinois River on June 2nd and June 3rd, just before Joseph wrote the letter to Emma on June 4th. I'm going to show you 8 accounts about this event on June 2nd and 3rd, which come from 6 people who were in the camp. One by George A. Smith, one by Reuben McBride, one by Moses Martin, one by Levi Hancock, one by Heber C. Kimball, and 3 by Wilford Woodruff, one of which he wrote while he was the prophet. But first, I do want to acknowledge the elephant in the room that stands out in most of these accounts and can't be ignored while reading them, even though it's off the subject of the video. The accounts talk about finding a skeleton, which they say Joseph said belonged to a Lamanite who had white skin when he was alive because of his righteousness, which I think is absurd. Since the church began in 1830, it has often spoke up in defense of Native Americans and African Americans, which was against the culture norm of the United States back then. But in contrast to that, during the same time, much of the church really did believe that light skin was a blessing for righteousness and that dark skin was a curse for wickedness. And this is a sin that not only much of the church was guilty of, but much of the entire United States has been guilty of throughout its history too. And some people in our country are still guilty of it today, including some church members. The Nephites in the Book of Mormon were guilty of it as well. It's a horrible sin that's almost as old as mankind itself, and it can't be swept under the rug, but must be acknowledged and repented of. The church began repenting of this sin back in 1978, which was about a decade after the Civil Rights Movement, but it's made some good progress over the decades since then. Anyway, I know that was off subject, but I think it had to be said while showing these accounts, rather than ignoring it as if it wasn't there. Anyway, back to the accounts, and you can just pause the video to read all of them. Some of them mention details that others don't, and there are a few minor contradictions between the accounts, but the same thing happens in the 4 accounts of Jesus Christ's life in the Bible, so don't let that sort of thing distract you. So as I mentioned before, Zion's camp had crossed the Illinois River on June 2nd and had set up camp on the west side. There were multiple mounds and fort ruins in that area from the ancient mound builders. That same day, June 2nd, George A. Smith and some others went to the top of the mound, dug into it, and found some human bones. The next day, on June 3rd, Joseph Smith, Moses Martin, Heber C. Kimball, and others went up to the top of the mound as well. They saw human bones on the ground, probably the bones that George's group had dug up the previous day, and they also saw 3 stone altars. After going partway back down the mound, Joseph felt prompted to have some of the men start digging at a certain spot. As they dug, they found almost an entire skeleton with an arrowhead stuck in his ribs. They brought the arrowhead and some of the bones back to camp, where Levi Hancock and Wilford Woodruff were. However, Wilford may have gone up, or at least part way up the mound with them, and then came back down to camp while the others dug. But it's clear that Wilford did go up to the top of the mound at some point. Anyway, later that morning or afternoon, Joseph received a vision from the Lord, where the Lord told him that the skeleton was a man named Zelph, who was a Lamanite, a man of God, and a warrior in a Nephite army led by a prophet named Onandagus, who was known in all the land from the hill Cumorah and eastern sea all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Onandagus and Zelph were righteous men, and Zelph died from the arrow that struck him through the ribs. Now there's another account of the event written for History of the Church by men who were not in Zion's camp, but it's written as if Joseph himself was saying it. The first copy in manuscript A1 was written by Willard Richards sometime between 1839 to 1843, but had some heavy edits made to it, which appears to be at various times between 1845 to 1904, because the backup copy in manuscript A2 was written in 1845 and is almost exactly the same as the unedited A1 version. And the first printed version in the January 1st, 1846 edition of the Times and Seasons is almost exactly the same as well. The second printed version in the June 1888 edition of a paper called The Historical Record has more edits made to it, as well as the 1904 edition of History of the Church, Volume 2. And then the 1948 edition of History of the Church, Volume 2 restored some of the unedited A1 version, and is still in today's most current edition. Anyway, all in all, these various versions combine most of the details from the 6 men's accounts who were in the camp. Joseph and others from the camp may or may not have been involved with the writing and editing of these versions. We just don't know. But the unedited A1 version is the only one written during Joseph's lifetime. Now, getting back to the prophet Joseph's general account in the letter he wrote to Emma, when you combine it with the 2 accounts of the May 16th incident and the 8 accounts of the June 2nd and 3rd incident by these 6 witnesses from the camp, which includes Wilford Woodruff's 3rd account, which he wrote while he was the prophet, testifying that Joseph had that vision from the Lord, then there are some definites from these accounts, which are that the plains and mounds they had seen during Zion's camp belonged to the Nephites, and so did the skulls and bones which they had found. And Joseph did have a vision from the Lord that Zelph was a Lamanite man of God in the army of Onandagus, who was a Nephite prophet of God, and was known from the hill Cumorah and eastern sea to the Rocky Mountains. Now, some of the more obscure details would go in the maybe category, like when Levi Hancock said that Joseph told Sylvester Smith that this land was called the Land of Desolation. And is the Eastern Sea the Atlantic Ocean, as Reuben McBride thought? Or is it Lake Ontario, which is much closer to the hill Cumorah, which Wilford mentioned in his earlier accounts before he was the prophet? Things like these are maybes and can be left to opinion for now, but the main points of the event are definites.